A great evening to one and all. Our today's lesson's name is The Triumph of Surgery from the textbook Footprints of Grade 10. This lesson consists of three main characters. The first character's name is Dr. Harriot. He is a veterinarian. And the second character's name is Miss Pumphrey, a wealthy and rich lady. She has a loving dog. The dog's name is Tricky. These are the three main characters. One day, Dr. Harriot saw Tricky on the road. He was worried about Tricky's pathetic plight. He has grown hugely fat, like a blotted sausage with a leg at corner. His eyes were bloodshot and dreamy. He was staring straight. His tongue was lolling out from his jaws. Dr. Harriot asked Mrs. Pumphrey why Tricky was looking so weak. Mrs. Pumphrey replied, "It is because of malnutrition. That is why the reason she has been feeding Tricky with extra malt, cod liver oil, a bowl of Horlicks." Then the doctor asked, "Did you cut down the sweet things?" Mrs. Pumphrey replied, "He likes sweet cakes and chocolates. How can I refuse?" The expected call came within few days. Miss Pumphrey was distraught. She said Tricky would eat nothing. She even refused to eat her favorite dishes. Mr. Harriot had a plan. The only way to cure Tricky is to bring him out of the house for a fortnight. Fortnight means 14 days. And to keep him under observation. Mr. Harriot informed the same thing to Mrs. Pumphrey, for which she was almost fainted. But somehow she got convinced for the sake of Tricky. When Mr. Harriot was taking Tricky to his car, all the maids were following him, carrying cushions, lunch balls, rugs, etc. Harriot was worried that his car would not accommodate all this stuff. All the dogs surrounded him, sniffed him, and left him like an uninterested object, and Tricky laid on his bed, motionless. For the next 2 days, doctor did not feed anything to Tricky, except water. From the third day onwards, Tricky started showing some interest in the surroundings. The next day, when Tristan slopped food into the bowls, all the remaining dogs, just rushed towards the food. As if it is a competition, they didn't want to miss the food. The next day, Dr. Harriot put an extra bowl to Tricky, and he felt happy to see Tricky jostling for food. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey started bringing round-boiled eggs to build up Tricky's strength, wine to enrich Tricky's blood, and the last surprise is brandy. Those were the days of great content for Harriot. Harriot, along with his friends, started the breakfast with extra boiled eggs, continued with midday wine, ended with luxuriously around the fire with brandy. Mr. Harriot informed Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky has recovered and he is awaiting for collection. The arrival of Mrs. Pumphrey, Harriot brought Tricky to Mrs. Pumphrey. Having seen Mrs. Pumphrey, Tricky jumped out of Harriet's hands and started licking Mrs. While returning home, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the car window with teary eyes, said to Dr. Harriot, "It is the triumph of surgery."